All right, so let's get started with our next speaker. I am very happy to introduce Bridget Deemer, who actually is one of the upcoming Rail and Coal Fellows in the next cohort. But Bridget also co-led an article in L&O Letters that is in the top downloaded articles from 2016 and 2017. So Bridget.
All right, thanks so much, Pat and the other session organizers, for inviting me here today, and thanks to all of you for sticking around on a Friday afternoon. I wanted to start by acknowledging my collaborators. So the spotlight article that I'm going to be talking about today actually came out of an Eco Days collaboration from the 2014 Eco Days, and this is a picture on the left of us at the 2015 ASLO conference. And then I'm going to segue into some work that I'm currently doing at the U.S. Geological Survey in Flagstaff, Arizona, in collaboration with Kim Dibble and Charles Yackulic, pictured there on the right. And so the motivation for all the work, really, that I'm going to be talking about today is just this pattern of global proliferation of dams. So this really massive hydrologic alteration to our freshwater ecosystems. And this is just a video that shows the temporal progression in dam construction across the globe through time. This is 6,000 of the world's largest dams. And our Eco Days group got really interested in what this hydrological modification means in terms of changes in river networks, and also how this large-scale modification overlays on another really large-scale driver of change, climate change, which we know is influencing important features of lake and reservoir ecosystems. So this is just a map of trends in surface water temperature in lakes across the globe. And so our group got interested in how are these artificial lakes responding to changes either similarly or differently than natural lakes are. And at the time, conceptual models for the effects of climate change on lake ecosystems they were either lumping lakes and reservoirs together, or they were noting that they weren't considering artificial water bodies in their climate change conceptual models. This model by Peter Levitt and colleagues is one example of a conceptual model, and it's one that we built on in our paper. And in this paper, they think about climate change drivers as either energy or mass fluxes that are partly being filtered through a catchment and then to a water body, but also that are directly entering a water body. And then these climate signals are reflected in export. In this case, the authors talk a lot about the sediment archive, but this could also just be downstream transport as well. And so our group got to thinking, are these catchment and water body filters sufficient for thinking about how climate drivers are represented in artificial water body systems? And we got to talking a lot about the important role of management, especially in reservoir systems. And you can kind of think of management as a twofold sort of decision-making process, where you have the initial decision-making about where a dam is placed in the landscape, and that decision is going to feed back to affect both the catchment and the water body features of the system, and then also how that dam is actively managed. So things like the height that water is withdrawn from the system, the volume of water that's released, and the temporal patterns of that release. And so to look at these differences in these catchment and water body and management filters, we use the National Lakes Assessment. This is a program run by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in cooperation with the states, where every 5 years folks go out and sample a random subset of lentic water bodies, lakes and reservoirs, for basic chemical, biological, and physical features of those systems. And I put lakes in quotation because at least in the case of the 2007 assessment, nearly half of the systems were actually artificial man-made or human-made water bodies. And what I think is pretty apparent just from looking at this map is that there's really different geographic distribution between the natural lakes in pink and the artificial lakes in white. And so we talked about this a lot, and this is addressed in the paper, but for the purposes of thinking about how these systems are different, we decided that at the regional scale at least, if we want to really think about what makes a reservoir different than a lake in a particular region, that we needed to kind of control for this geographic variation at the national scale. So what we did is to pair lake and reservoir systems that were less than 50 kilometers from each other. And the result was 66 pairs of lake and reservoir systems that are shown in the red triangles there. And so then we took those pairs and we compared basic properties of both the catchments of these systems, the catchment filters, so things like the perimeter of the system, the catchment area to surface area ratio, and then basic water body properties. In terms of management, the NLA has a visual estimate of water level fluctuation where they just look at the distance from the water level to the high water mark. And so that was really our only proxy there, but we also supplemented this with a literature search, just looking for any studies that compared differences in these basic properties that we think would affect climate response in these systems. And what we found is that lakes and reservoirs, turns out they do differ in all of these properties that we expect to affect the climate response. So probably no big surprise, reservoirs experience much greater water level fluctuation than natural lakes. In the NLA, reservoirs on average experienced 4 meters of fluctuation versus less than a meter in the lake systems. And reservoirs also had much larger catchments, larger catchment area to surface area ratios, and generally just more influence of the terrestrial catchment area on the water body, which you can also think about in terms of their lower residence time. So you have this larger influx to content ratio in a reservoir than you would in a natural lake. And we can see sort of these effects playing out in some of the water body characteristics. So the photic zone of reservoirs on average was about half that of the natural lakes, and their bottom waters were warmer. And so we took all this information combined with this literature review, and we modified the energy mass flux framework that I was telling you about before to sort of think about these lakes and reservoirs as separate in terms of how they might respond to a climate driver. And so in both cases, we chose to add a management filter because we know that there are a number of management actions that are implemented in natural lakes in addition to reservoirs, things like hypolimnetic oxygenation or temperature curtains. But we made the management filter larger in reservoirs given that they're inherently managed, so they have a managed withdrawal from most reservoir systems. And then we also reduced the size of the water body filter and increased the size of the catchment filter to reflect that higher influx to content ratio that we found with our NLA analysis. And so now we're really thinking about, can we test this sort of conceptual model and look for evidence that reservoirs actually are responding to drivers in a different way than lake ecosystems are. And we're really interested in using water clarity as a test variable, both because it's a powerful sentinel response variable, but also because it's of interest socioeconomically, and it has the potential to either amplify or suppress climate signals. So if your system is getting less clear, you're changing the distribution of temperature in your system, so you can have faster rates of warming in the surface, but actually cooling in the bottom waters, which is really interesting to think about when we start to think about the role of these systems in whole river networks. And so for this analysis, we're using both the 2007 and 2012 NLA sites, and you've got the reservoirs in brown and the lakes in blue there. And for the same sort of paired approach that I described before, what we're seeing is really consistent with our conceptual model in the sense that we have the 2007 NLA results on the left and the 2012 on the right. And what you see is that there's a change in the water clarity for the lakes, but that the clarity in the reservoirs is remaining relatively constant. So somehow drivers are acting differently on the lakes than on the reservoir systems between these two time points. And we're also really interested in starting to think about different scales in terms of how these differences between lakes and reservoirs play out. So at the national scale, we're finding something similar to what we found with our 2007 analysis, that reservoirs are less clear than lakes. But when we start to look at the ecoregion scale, we see that the patterns can be really different depending on where you're looking at. And these are just 3 ecoregions where we have relatively even distribution and sample size between lakes and reservoirs. And so now really quickly, I'm kind of running low on time, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing in the Colorado River Basin. I've been focusing on Lake Powell. And I think it's a really interesting case study of thinking about how climate change is playing out in a large reservoir ecosystem. And so in the Colorado River Basin, we're really interested in the climate effect of water temperature at a whole basin level. And this is just a map of baseline July river temperatures from 1985 to 2015. And what you can see is that Lake Powell, which is sort of located in the middle of that map there, is really setting the temperature for the river as it flows through Grand Canyon. And temperature is of particular interest because it's really defining the thermal regimes of native versus endangered fish in the basin. So right now, water spills from the hypolimnion of Lake Powell, and it results in this really cold thermal regime in the river. And so the question is, how are these different filters going to interact to affect temperature into the future in the Colorado River Basin? And when we look at a long-term record of summer metalimnion temperature, we see actually that temperatures are declining in the metalimnion of Lake Powell, and we think that that's related to reductions in Secchi depth over that same time period, so sort of that buffering I was talking to you about with a change in the water clarity. And that rate of metalimnion temperature decline is about 1.2 degrees per decade. But when we compare that to the role of water level in the system, we see that the interaction between water level and the management decisions, so both the decision about how much water is passed downstream and the decision to have a fixed withdrawal, it's really this water level and management regime that are the most important in determining downstream temperature. So these are just projections for July river temperatures in the basin under moderate and high emissions. And what you can see is that when we don't think about the role of Lake Powell, we have still relatively cold water coming out, assuming that the water in Lake Powell, the levels are staying high. But assuming the current management sort of regime of keeping Lake Mead and Lake Powell at the same level, we could be facing a 7-degree increase in temperature below the dam, just based on that combination of hydrologic inputs and management decisions. Okay, and I will wrap up. This is just a reminder of the conceptual model, and then I talked through a case study where hydrologic inputs from the catchment combine with decision-making at the dam to define the whole river network climate response. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge all the folks that have helped with this and funding sources. And I think maybe I have a minute for a question. I don't know.